McLaren master a qualifying crash theft by locking out the front row for the Hungarian Grand Prix. Lando Norris is on pole position with Oscar Piastri alongside him. But the big story from Hungary came in Q1 at the hands of Sergio Perez. From RacingNews365.com, my name is Nick Golding, and I'm joined as always by lead editor Ian Potts. Ian, we have to start with Q1 rather than Q3 and Sergio Perez. We know he is under so much pressure at the moment, and the one thing he did not need to do on a weekend where he had been looking good was put it in the wall. Not only did he put it in the wall, he put it in the wall in some heavy fashion.
You just can't make it up, can you, Nick? To be honest, if you're writing this plot line right now, you arguably would not have written that into the script at this particular point over these two races, because it's just unbelievable what is happening to him. And just to outline to everybody once again, we've discussed it many times, but Helmut Marko made quite clear, and Christian Horner to a lesser extent, but Helmut most definitely, the Red Bull advisor, basically stating that Perez had got these two races, after which they would then discuss his situation over the summer break, with the seeming inclination from Helmut that Liam Lawson will likely get a promotion of some sort, be it into the Red Bull seat alongside Max, or the RB seat in place of Yuki Tsunoda or Daniel Ricciardo, and potentially one of those then becoming Max's teammate for the rest of the season after the summer break. So for Perez then to do exactly what he did, and as you say, that was not just a slight off, that was a heavy smash that is going to have the Red Bull boys on his side of the garage working quite considerably to get that car in good shape for tomorrow's Grand Prix. That pressure now has increased tenfold after what has happened. Christian Horner has made it quite clear and has basically said, this team is running one-legged right now. Running one-legged, quote unquote, bearing in mind what's going on with Checo. Yeah, that's quite a damning indictment. Helmut Marko again reiterating that no decision's going to be made now. They've basically given Checo these two races, and the discussions will take place over the summer break. But what on earth is Checo going to do from pretty much the back of the grid or a pit lane start or whatever it might be, depending on what alterations need to be made to that RB20? Because this is a circuit that, as we know, is very difficult to overtake. Yes, he's still got a good car beneath him. Yes, we are going to get searingly hot conditions again tomorrow after the cloud cover, as you can see above me right now, and the sprinkling of rain that we had that really added to the mix for qualifying and undoubtedly played a part in Checo's crash. It's going to be a real struggle for him just to even get into the points around this circuit. Guy's still got a good chance. It's many laps in which to do it. There are the odd places here and there, but nevertheless, after that today, my God, he's going to have to pull out one almighty performance tomorrow and one almighty Belgian Grand Prix weekend to give himself any hope of saving his seat going forward after the summer break.
And of course, if his confidence was already low, his crash was a confidence crusher. Whereas it's the complete opposite for McLaren, who secured their first 1-2 since, and let me get this right, the 2012 Brazilian Grand Prix. It was quite spectacular by McLaren, who mastered what was a very difficult qualifying session with red flags, one in Q3, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Norris on pole. He's been quite downbeat recently, given how he's necessary. He missed out on victory in Silverstone. He obviously missed out on a win in Austria. He's been on it all weekend, and Oscar as well has been right behind him.
It's been fabulous to see that car. I mean, we've talked many occasions when Red Bull and Max have been so dominant. The car on rails on occasions. This was one of those occasions where you only had to look at Lando's onboard to see how precise that McLaren, how he was placing that McLaren into the corners, and how it was just holding going through those corners as well, because obviously this is a circuit that's got many turns, and quite clearly as I say, that McLaren just on rails on this occasion, going around the Hungaroring. But quite clearly as well, Oscar Piastri, just so close to him as well. It could have been his day, who knows? But Lando just getting it so right, so perfect. And a McLaren 1-2 lockout of the front row, as you say, Nick, for the first time in 12 years. That's got that team hooting and hollering. They've still got to do the business, though, on Sunday, because they will be very mindful of the fact that they've been in very good positions so far this season. And aside from Lando's win in Miami, they've really not mastered a Sunday to its fullest extent. They should have had other wins aside from that one in Miami. This is the perfect opportunity now from 1-2 on the grid to absolutely nail it and get that, let's face it, I'm going to say long overdue, even though we're only talking about Miami back in May. But even so, the positions that they've been, as I've said, it is effectively long overdue because they should have had more victories in the bag by now.
And just on the topic of McLaren as well, of course, it's a really interesting one how they're going to manage this, because they have obviously got Max Verstappen right behind in third. But Oscar, you've got to think this is potentially the closest he will ever have a chance of winning a race. But does Andrea Stella make the team manager 1-2? Does he make Austria kind of play the game of being Lando's wingman to defend against Max? Or do you think McLaren are going to allow both drivers to race, given that actually we have still got so many races to go this season? There isn't as such a championship fight to be won or lost.
I'll tell you what, Nick, we know what the Hungaroring is like, because Max is on third and he was so close himself. I think it was 0.06 something of a second. So that gives you some idea just how close those top three were. I mean, Max we mentioned there was somebody in the final turn that potentially held him up that we could have just got that pole. But just going back to what I was referring to, we know what the Hungaroring is like. Do not blink, folks, over those first few corners, because I think they're going to be pretty phenomenal to watch. Make absolutely no bones about it. With the heat tomorrow, with it being a dry track, Max, I'm certain, is going to be going for it through those first 1, 2, 3, 4 corners, because they are a particular sight to behold in Formula One racing. When you've got cars battling so close together. There was if you happen to see it, there was a remarkable incident in F2 today involving Oliver Behrman and two of his rivals either side of him, sandwiched. It was later in the race, but regardless, he was sandwiched 3 car abreast going through turns 2 and 3. I think we might just get something like that tomorrow, because Max, I'm pretty certain he's going to be going for it against those McLarens. But yeah, just getting back to your point, Nick. Yes, Andrea Stella does have a race to manage. Yes, of course, Oscar's going to want to be going for it against Lando into those early turns. But of course, Oscar's going to be very mindful. And Lando as well, because he's going to have Max right behind him on the right side of the grid. Oscar on the dirtier side of the grid, so he's got to get a really good getaway to ensure that if he's not there challenging Lando, he's at least there defending Lando from Max. So yeah, the start tomorrow is going to be absolutely crucial for all three of those guys, but especially for McLaren, in my view, to at least give themselves the best possible chance to get that long overdue win once again, as I say, even though that last victory was only in Miami.
I'm going to take that as your bold prediction. You heard it here, folks. Ian Parker said there's going to be 3 wide during the first
wide
couple
going round
of 3 wide
turns. Yeah, do not be surprised.
We obviously, I mentioned a couple of minutes ago that, of course, there was a red flag in Q3, and I said at the top of this F1 update that it was, for a qualifying session, a bit of a crash fest, and a big crash fest in that, because we had the huge Sergio Perez shunt in Q1. In Q3, keeping within the Red Bull family, a really nasty shunt for Yuki Tsunoda in the dying minutes of Q3 whilst on his final hot lap, which kind of led to a bizarre couple of minutes where obviously several drivers were waiting in the pit lane thinking they could get another lap in, but of course their tyres were shot, they couldn't do it. And at the same time, Max Verstappen knew he wouldn't improve, was out of his car, got weighed and was busy chatting to the FIA president. But Yuki's crash, having done so well to get to Q3, he almost, it kind of did go slightly airborne. It was a really nasty hit, and you could see afterwards the way he was kind of just holding himself over the barrier, it looked like one that hurt.
Quite obviously, because he didn't carry out the full extent of his media duties.
Okay.
He went to the medical centre, was checked over, and he then went to the pen, did his TV stuff, but didn't do the written. Apparently, on the advice of the medical staff here, to go and rest. Of course, in many respects, drivers are obliged to carry out their TV media duties post-qualifying and post-race. Part of the contractual obligations that they have with the TV companies, who, of course, as we know, pay an awful lot of money to be here and to get as much content as they can to fill their programs. So, yes, Yuki told to go and rest. And in fairness, I listened to one of his interviews, one of his TV interviews with Formula1.com, actually. And so, from my perspective, he didn't quite sound right. He didn't quite sound coherent enough. His sentences and what he was saying were a little bit jumbled. That's just my humble opinion anyway, but have a listen, folks, see what you think. And, I mean, he said, funny enough, he actually said he was more concerned for his car than his body. So that goes to show that quite clearly he must have been feeling something. Checo Perez as well, just getting back to him, he said he hurt his leg to a certain extent, but for the most part, he was okay. Just to add, additionally to Checo, from what I mentioned earlier, he apologized to the team, which is something that he's quite now obviously feeling. He said additionally that mentally he's now feeling it, this run of performances, this run of results. So that gives you some idea as to where he is at going forward. But I asked him specifically, bearing in mind Helmut Marko's quotes about these two races and what it meant, he did say that he wasn't worried, but I bet you deep down, Nick, and to everybody listening, he's got to be worried, because at the end of the day, he knew coming into this weekend, he pretty much got these two Grand Prix to pretty much save his Red Bull seat. Effectively, could be his F1 career, given the run of form he's on at the moment, because he's just not on it. And with Yuki crashing as well, does that open a door for Daniel Ricciardo now, if Red Bull are going to make a move over the course of the summer break? Daniel, in speaking to him in an exclusive interview on Thursday, he said to me that he knew that he too had these two Grand Prix effectively to pull up his socks, or in his own words, and I'll use his own words, to kick some arse. Well, he's not made a bad job of it so far, because he's looked strong. He didn't have a good FP1, but he's looked very strong in FP2, and he had a good FP3, and then he had a really good qualifying getting into Q3. Yes, of course, George was missing, and Checo, I'm going to say, to a lesser extent.
Yeah.
Even without that crash, would he have got into Q3 anyway? We don't know, because of the run of form that he's on. But nevertheless, it's about being in the right place at the right time and performing at the right time as well. Both Yuki and Daniel did that, and Daniel's come out the better for it because of Yuki's crash. It's going to be fascinating to see what is now going to happen within that Red Bull family over the course of that summer break, because quite clearly there's a lot to discuss.
And of course, it was the Hungarian Grand Prix 12 months ago where Daniel Ricciardo made his return to F1, following a 6-month hiatus, and then doing what was a very successful test for Red Bull in Silverstone. So again, another storyline that's going to be fascinating to follow. To quickly run through the top 10 off, it's Lando Norris and Oscar Piastri on the front row, with Max Verstappen in third. Carlos Sainz in fourth. Ferrari's had a very good weekend, actually. Ferrari looking somewhat back at the races. Lewis Hamilton in fifth. We'll talk about Mercedes in a second. Charles Leclerc in sixth. Fernando Alonso in seventh. Lance Stroll in eighth. Daniel Ricciardo in ninth. And I suppose for now, Yuki Tsunoda in seventh. But given the amount of damage to his car, who knows what new parts will we need, and if a penalty. Obviously, we don't know enough, but you'd imagine that there's a very high chance of that. On the topic of Mercedes, Hamilton in fifth, but of course, the cloud cover seemed to have helped them today in a way. But the big thing, the big worry for them was George Russell was the second big shock to be out in Q1. He was not happy. He seemingly set his final Q1 lap too early. And of course, the circuit was drying somewhat at the time following a slight rain shower. And as you've said yourself, tomorrow it is going to be seriously hot. And as we know, Mercedes don't like the heat. It feels like for George in particular, he's got a very difficult Sunday ahead of him.
He was not a happy camper, to put it mildly, Nick. He described himself as angry, which for George Russell, that is very, very strong. We know, folks, that George is a relatively mild-mannered guy for the most part.
And very well worded.
And very well worded as well. Yes, he knows exactly what to say, but he was angry. Basically, what happened is that once after Perez's crash was cleared, there was about 6.5 minutes left of track action. Yeah. The track was wet at that particular time, and they sent George out. He was one of the first out on track. The majority of the others stayed behind in the garage. They underfueled him. So by the time the track began to dry towards the end of the session, he didn't have enough fuel on board to get in that final lap on the soft tyres when it was really needed the most. And that's when the majority of the guys ahead of him were setting their quickest laps. Daniel Ricciardo, for argument's sake, ended up, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Nick, was P1 at the end of Q1.
Yeah.
He was the fastest. So that gives you some idea. You had to be, as I say, on track at the right time, and he did that. He delivered that. Yeah. George wasn't. 17th, not happy. He made it clear that talks were going to have to take place within Mercedes. Toto Wolff, in fairness to him, has absolutely pulled no punches, described it as an underperformance of the team, that quite clearly they'd let George down on this occasion, and this was not something that should have happened, that there's going to be a major debrief, miscommunication across the team, according to George, and trackside engineering director Andrew Shovlin as well. He was also clearly not happy on George's part. Yes, yeah. Mercedes, as without a shadow of a doubt, let George Russell down today. And from starting on pole position 2 weeks ago at Silverstone, he's going to be towards the back of the grid. And the best he can hope for right now on Sunday is at least a small smattering of points. Lewis ahead of him in 5th. Now, bizarrely, you said the cloud cover should have helped Mercedes. And arguably, yes, it should. But bizarrely, Andrew Shovlin has turned around and said that on this occasion, the lower track temperature actually didn't help the car. So go figure. Go figure with that Mercedes. It clearly needs an optimal window. Lewis hasn't been performing. He admitted that in the written media pen afterwards. It's not been a great weekend for him at all. He's not been happy with the car. It's not doing what he wants it to do going into these many turns. And in many respects, he was quite fortunate to come away with 5th, sandwiching the Ferraris. Can he go forward? Well, we know the Mercedes always goes better in race trim compared to qualifying trim, especially for Lewis. He's really struggled in qualifying against George this season. 10-3 now the count. And it arguably should have been 11-2 by any stretch of the imagination if George had got into Q3, because he definitely had the pace on Lewis so far. Yeah. But as is pointed out, we're not going to be getting this dark cloud cover tomorrow. It is going to be back to the Friday temperatures, the hot track temperatures that we saw, 40 plus degrees track temperature. We can look at around 30 degrees air temperature. So the Mercedes is likely going to struggle, but Lewis is better in race trim, as I say, or the Mercedes is better in race trim. So we can see what he can achieve. Can he push the top 3 ahead? Mercedes has said they're going to try and get him towards those podium positions, but I think personally it's going to be a real struggle for Lewis and Mercedes to score a top 3 unless we get that 3 abreast going into those first few turns and something occurs out of it. I think that's going to be the only hope for Lewis of a podium place, that something amongst the top 3 happens that gives him that helping hand.
Well, I mean, how the tables have turned for Mercedes since Silverstone. I mean, what a qualifying session we have. We had an amazing one in Silverstone. This one might have just topped it, but we have an absolutely incredible race ahead of us tomorrow. There is no doubting that. You've obviously given your bold prediction. You're saying 3 wide in one of the first 2 corners. I'm going to go for an Oscar Piastri victory and the next duel between Max and Lando. I can't wait for tomorrow. It's going to be exciting. This has been the latest episode of the Racing News 365.com podcast. Podcast isn't a podcast. I'm too excited. F1 update. I'm too used to saying podcast. It's because the podcast is doing very, very well, actually. I'm glad I said that, because the podcast actually hit 250,000 listens, and that's only thanks to all of you guys tuning in. So despite my mistake, I'm quite glad I made it now. For myself and Ian, we'll see you tomorrow for the Hungarian Grand Prix race F1 update. We'll see you later. Bye.
And as always, take care, folks.